What's up, Rich Life listeners? Today, Paul and I are here with a little bit of marriage counseling for each other as we both make these mistakes constantly. But at least we admit it. My wife says, you can't just keep apologizing and keep making the same mistakes. But hey,
Oh boy.
whatever. It's the fourth horseman is what we're talking today. And the horsemen are created by John Gottman. He says if you're doing one of these four things, you better watch out because it's a big predictor of divorce. And today's one is stonewalling.
Let's just review real quickly for our listeners in case this is their first episode. The Gottmans studied thousands of couples in a lab and distilled down to four things that are the highest predictor of divorce and separation. And they were able to do this to such a high degree that they were able to predict divorce in over 90% of cases just by observing people arguing, right? And all couples argue. In fact, arguing is not necessarily bad, but it's oftentimes how we argue and how we resolve these conflicts that determines whether or not this argument is a negative thing or something that is constructive and actually builds on the relationship. The four horsemen are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So today is the fourth installment of this. And for our listeners, if you want to listen to the other episodes, we have separate episodes on the first three horsemen. To dive right into today's topic, stonewalling is the fourth horseman. Stonewalling is basically something that occurs when you withdraw from an interaction while you're staying physically present. So essentially, this means that you're not giving cues that you're listening or paying attention, right? For instance, you avoid eye contact, you cross your arms. The pattern could go something like this. You're in an argument, you're feeling criticized, and you decide to turn away. The more you turn away, this gives the cue to the pursuer or the other speaker that you're not paying attention. And this leads your partner to attack even more. And you feel your heart rate start to go up, and this makes you actually afraid to say anything for fear of making things worse. However, by withdrawing and turning away from your partner, you actually make things even worse because you're perpetuating a negative spiral and the conflict just gets worse and the issue remains unresolved.
Yeah, I key in on that word withdrawing, right? I think sometimes it gets intense or it's just a constant pattern and you're just like, screw this. I just need to check out a little bit.
At its core, stonewalling is oftentimes a response to emotional flooding. So in other words, when someone feels overwhelmed by conflict and doesn't really know how to respond productively. This happens a lot more frequently in men. We'll talk about why later. Previously for the other horsemen, we talked about how certain ones are more prevalent in say women. But stonewalling, this one, statistically speaking, is more present in men.
Yeah, the other ones are more like criticism. It's like you're doing this. They're more like verbal thing. This stonewalling is not necessarily a word, but it's more of a reaction.
Correct. And it is oftentimes a response to criticism. Common behaviors include staying silent, walking away mid-conversation, or you can just simply say, I don't want to talk about this. So why is stonewalling so harmful? Stonewalling sends a powerful message, whether intended or not, that you don't matter enough for me to stay engaged. For the other person, or what we'll call the pursuer, this can lead to feelings of being abandoned, feeling lonely, and resenting the partner, especially if the pursuer is trying to connect or resolve a problem. So according to the Gottmans, when stonewalling becomes a habit, it really significantly increases the risk of relationship dissatisfaction. And if it goes on long enough, it'll actually lead to a strong chance of a breakup. Over time, the partner who is shut out might very well feel rejected or invisible, might cause him or her to stop communicating altogether. And over time, this builds resentment, emotional distance, and even contempt, which is the third horseman that we talked about in a previous episode.
Yeah, so you break this down, and in this case, the stonewaller is the person who is being pursued. You coined the term the pursuer as the person
Yeah,
who's jabbing at them.
exactly. So let's talk a little bit more about why people stonewall. At its root, stonewalling is a type of passive aggressive behavior. It really comes from feeling physiologically distressed. So when the Gottmans studied these thousands of couples, they found that we'll call it the stonewaller, the stonewaller is typically experiencing an elevated heart rate, usually at least 100 beats per minute. They're also experiencing tight muscles. When they test their blood cortisol levels, the cortisol levels are usually spiked. So these people who are stonewalling might oftentimes appear calm on the outside, but deep inside, their autonomic nervous system is actually revved up and they're in fight or flight mode. And so what happens is that instead of trying to lash out on fights or being defensive, they actually shut down to preserve themselves and the peace. Some of the intentions are actually not bad. So oftentimes a stonewaller might feel like, hey, I don't want to escalate things, so I'm not going to say anything. However, oftentimes it's not recognized that way by the pursuer, who will then take this behavior or silence as signs that my partner just simply doesn't care. And so the pursuer will just oftentimes intensify the criticism or the attack.
You were mentioning earlier that typically the guy is the one being the stonewaller on the receiving end, and the spouse, the female, not to just saying in typical, right? Sometimes it's opposite, but typically the female is the one that's pecking at them.
Correct. And I think there's several reasons for this. So one is that men on average, they're more likely to become physically overwhelmed during a conflict, triggering withdrawal. And there's anthropological reasons for this that researchers speculate dates back to the days of cavemen and cave women. So during that time, it made sense in men for their stress hormones to be elevated longer, especially if they're out hunting and there's danger around. You want it to be elevated so that you can stay alert. Whereas if you're back in the village tending to the campfire, it really doesn't behoove you to have elevated stress hormones for very long. Right? It's actually better if it just spikes in times of danger and then it quickly goes back down so that you can tend to other things. Right? This is what anthropologists posited. Another reason is that in terms of socialization, a lot of men are raised with messages to suppress emotional expression, keep calm or keep stoic, making withdrawal seem like the safest option. And then, as I mentioned before, oftentimes stonewallers, they feel that this strategy is actually good for preventing escalation. But as we talked about earlier, it actually oftentimes unintentionally causes even greater emotional distance. So then what about the other partner? In this case, we'll call the other partner the pursuer, right? When one person stonewalls, the pursuer oftentimes feels a pressure to resolve the issue. Oftentimes you'll hear him or her raise their voice or demand engagement. Right? Sometimes they'll call this behavior protest behavior. The pursuer might do things like ask questions repeatedly, escalate the tone or volume, be more demanding, or express panic, fear, frustration about being ignored. It's not a good feeling to feel like the other person's not listening to you and you're being ignored.
Yeah, I guess something that came to mind is I think this is a Gottman tactic too, but when people get floored, you're supposed to take a break and you're supposed to have a safe word. But when is it stonewalling and when is it a called break? In a way, what's to stop a stonewaller person from just calling a timeout?
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, so this is a perfect segue into antidotes to stonewalling. The first one you mentioned is taking a self-soothing break. Instead of emotionally checking out, the key is to tell your partner, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed. Can we take a 20-minute break and come back to this? The key is that you got to come back to it. For those who have a very strong reaction and it takes them a while for their nervous system to calm back down, it could be more than 20 minutes. I've recommended if an argument is taking place at night, to sleep on it and revisit it in the morning. But the key is you have to revisit it. You can't just say, oh, let's shelve this and use that as a tactic to never revisit it.
Going to sleep and taking naps does wonders because sometimes you don't want to come back to it.
But even if it's 20 minutes, oftentimes if you do something like deep breathing, go for a walk or listen to some music, that 20 minutes will help your nervous system calm down. When you're calmed down, you're able to engage in a discussion with a lot more empathy and with basically your full brain intact to be able to think outside the box. When you're in fight or flight mode, it's neurologically impossible to resolve these issues in a constructive and empathetic manner.
Problem solve together, right? You just
Exactly.
can't do that.
Exactly. I think another antidote is to recognize stonewalling when it happens. If you notice it in your partner, it's okay to gently call it out without blaming. If you tend to be the pursuer, you can say something like, "Hey, I notice that when we argue, we sometimes stop talking. I want us to feel safe enough to stay engaged."
That can be a tricky subject though, right? If you're calling it out, then it always comes across as criticism, right? Like you're trying to pick your words very carefully there, but it still kind of came across as criticism. Another Gottman
Yeah.
trademarked for Horsemen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the key is to try to not have it come across as a criticism, as we talked about in
Yeah.
previously. For criticism, you want to avoid like pointing your finger or saying
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. What you said was, I noticed we argue. We all sometimes stop talking. So there was no you in it, but even I fulfilled in the blank with you. But yeah, like the word you and whenever you fight is a huge no-no word, generally
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah. Better to increase that teamwork dynamic.
Yeah, it just rounds out the edges of the ninja star. You're throwing these things around.
Another tactic that you can use is couples who are good about this. They have a ritual after each difficult conversation to signal re-engagement, whether it's a hug, holding hands, or just expressing appreciation for the other person willing to talk it out.
These are always the things that what you're trying to do is you're trying to put back coins in the emotional piggy bank, but it's easier said than done. You can't just high five each other after one of these very damaging interactions. You almost got to plan a long vacation or staycation or some kind of big event to get back an ounce of what you lost.
Yeah.
I think people understand the point, what you're trying to do, the goal is.
Right.
Oftentimes it's just sad when you hear people going through these types of things, like you're already hearing the way they're talking about the situation. Any of these four horsemen, and you're already like, man, they got no brake pad or they have no cartilage in the knee at this point. There's none of that social piggy bank built up between them.
Yeah, totally. Oftentimes with stonewalling, it stems from not knowing how to name or express emotions. Just a little bit of a personal anecdote. This is something I personally had to work on, which involved working with a therapist and a coach. And I remember she would actually whip out something called an emotion wheel. And every time I didn't know what word to use, she put out this emotion wheel and said, "Go through this and tell me like which one most closely resonates to how you're feeling." So we did that for a while, and that gradually increased my emotional vocabulary. Even I noticed that over time, when your emotional vocabulary is larger, then you're less likely to stonewall because you're able to express how you're feeling in the heat of the moments. And by extension, then you're able to more likely express what you need. Yeah. This is a problem that's probably more common in men who, oftentimes they're raised to not show as much emotions. Oftentimes their emotional vocabulary isn't as strong. Let's talk a little bit about the pursuer now. What things that you can and ideally should recognize when you have an argument and you're dealing with someone who is stonewalling. Number one, definitely want to pause and breathe and recognize the cycle and really try to tone down the urge to chase and pursue.
Yeah. Or just understand that this person's not trying to mess with you by running away or stonewalling you. They're just trying to deal with what's going on and to take ownership. You are pursuing them. You are the initiator here as the pursuer. Have some grace for the other person.
Yeah, precisely.
I just say that because I'm usually on the other end. I'm empathetic more towards the stonewaller than the pursuer.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, man.
Yeah. You should make shirts. Stonewaller and the pursuer.
I can tell this topic resonates with us. So going back to the pursuer, ideally, if you tend to be the pursuer, you want to calmly say, "Hey, I can see that you need a break, and I want us to return to this when we both feel ready." Just in case the stonewaller isn't able to communicate that they need a break to do some physiological self-soothing. If you can identify that, then things are more likely to end well. Another thing to do related to criticism, which is one of the other four horsemen, it's to practice soft startups and lead with a sense of curiosity instead of urgency. Instead of saying, gosh darn it, you didn't put away the dishes again. You didn't take out the trash again.
Oh, you said it. You said the Y word.
Exactly. That's oftentimes a criticism. Instead of leading with like a you statement or a criticizing statement, try to express some curiosity instead. Hey, I noticed the trash is taken out. Did you have a really busy day? How's your day going? How are things going? Express curiosity. That's oftentimes a better way than to start pointing fingers and throwing attacks. Lastly, try to avoid interpreting the stonewalling as rejection and recognize that it is actually a sign of the other person feeling overwhelmed. It's not that they don't care.
Admittedly, like it's both people who are overwhelmed, right? The pursuer too. That's why they're coming after them. At least the way I look at it, it's involuntary. Not that the person is mean or a horrible person. It's just an involuntary human reaction. And
Right.
I've framed it that way to understand it better.
Yeah, that's a good way to understand it. You're absolutely right. Both people are feeling overwhelmed, but expressing it in different ways. It's just unfortunate that this dynamic happens a lot in relationships. If unchecked, it'll lead to a downward spiral, right? And over time, if this is a recurring pattern, then oftentimes that leads to your relationship or your marriage dying a slow death. So this is definitely something to be aware of and to start practicing these antidotes, not just with this particular horseman, but with the other three as well. A lot of this stuff takes practice. Practice makes perfect. The same applies for these kinds of techniques. And it oftentimes involves being intentional and being mindful, which is tough where you're in arguments and your body is in fight or flight mode. But oftentimes I would say that the awareness won't begin like, right away, like before an argument or fight takes place. Oftentimes it'll start to occur to you after the fact. Awareness after the fact is 1,000 times better than having no awareness at all. If you have awareness of what happened even after a fight, then it's possible to start to recognize it more and more often to the point that you'll start to catch it when you're in the middle of a fight or when a fight is beginning.
Yeah, as we say many times on this podcast, awareness is the first step. Maybe another tip is if you've got kids, I bet the kids do this too. You and your spouse can get on the same page and maybe poke a little fun at it. At least both of you are third party identifying it together. It just helps that awareness stage, but also an understanding on where it comes from, typically between you and your spouse. If you have a nice conversation, maybe do one of those social piggy bank exercises where you go on a date, you discuss, hey, how did your parents manifest their, like who stonewalled in
Mm.
your family? And I think there can be some realization from that is, hey, it's not my spouse's fault. It's because her dad did it or whatever, or vice versa.
And I love that point you made because oftentimes our coping mechanisms and the way that we handle or engage in conflicts, we oftentimes learn these habits from our parents or those who raised us. And oftentimes we model the behavior that we grew up around. So that's a really good point.
Yeah. If you don't have any parents anymore, just spy on your friends, see what they do.
Yeah.
But I think if anything, it just helps with the awareness, identifying it. Because if you can start to label these things, then you are more aware of it. And then you can at least put up some type of resistance when it does rear its ugly head.
Hopefully, you guys found this topic useful. Hopefully, it gave you something to think about next time you're in this sort of situation. Think about how's your body reacting when you're feeling overwhelmed. What do you need? What does your partner need when one of you is withdrawing? Can you create some sort of shared plan with your partner for what to do when one of you feels flooded?
Yeah. It feels super unfair when your partner is doing all these things to you. Sometimes maybe you just want to talk to somebody, or I think that's why you hire somebody like Poe, because it helps you get in the beginning, it's not going to be pretty. You're just going to be taking gut punches, stonewalling left and right. That at least if one person, and the person listening to this podcast, is probably going to have to be the leader in terms of this first. But maybe just talking to somebody about this, or if you have a friend, I'm sure they do the same things. If you guys can point it out and label it, but also understand that everybody does this too. It's not just your spouse hates you. It's just
Yeah.
everybody does these things too.
Yeah, exactly. And even happy, healthy couples do this. The only difference is that Healthy, happy couples are able to recognize this and the other horsemen when conflict arises. And they're able to prevent it from getting out of control. And then when you have the right antidotes in place, and you know what to do. Conflicts can actually oftentimes be opportunities for growth and deepening the relationship.
I think when you get better at this, the intensity doesn't go as high, but you can recover from it quicker.
All right, so then that's a wrap. If you guys have any questions, comments, feel free to leave it in the comment section on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, hope you found this topic helpful, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.